Hi, everyone. My name is M. Farmer, and I'm the Research Impact and Psychology Librarian for Florida Gulf Coast University. Today, my presentation will be a part of the Open for Student Success Symposium hosted by Georgia State University. My presentation today is an alternative argument for OER, increasing research impact. Let me start off with explaining why I'm calling this an alternative argument. I believe that frequently when we discuss OER, we emphasize the benefits and the importance that OER has with students. Um, I think, though, that there are certain faculty members who need a little extra encouragement or incentive to engage with OER. And so today I'm going to be taking more of a faculty perspective than that of the students. Though at the end I will wrap it back up with student success, the majority of this presentation will be based purely on the faculty. In this presentation, I will mainly argue that creating OER increases your research impact, and I'll explain how that can benefit you and, again, eventually your students. I will also cover how to include impact as part of your promotion or tenure portfolio. But before we get into all that, let me clarify and explain what research impact actually is. So research impact refers to the effects that your research has on society, the economy, and other fields of study. In other words, how influential is your research and your publications? There are two main types of research impact, academic and non-academic. Academic impact is what you may already be familiar with. It's associated with H-indexes and impact factors, citation counts. It's how has your research influenced other research following along after yours. Non-academic impact is how your research is influencing the world outside of academia. How have you affected the culture, society, the government, different institutions like companies or groups? How has what you've done changed what they are doing? Let's think of an example. Let's say a psychology professor um, publishes a study about mindfulness and stress relief. The academic impact of that publication would be how many times it had been cited by other academics or in journals. The non-academic impact would be how many times or how has that work influenced companies and how they manage stress relief with their employees, or how that study is being talked about like online. So this is an infographic created by the University College Dublin, and I really like it because it's just another way to look at research impact and see the differences between the two types. As you can see, academic impact is that blue square in the top left. Non-academic impact is literally everything else. Depending on the field that you're studying, you may be more or less likely to interact with certain aspects of non-academic impact. It's very difficult to cover all of them by just one publication or even in one career. And as part of this, I need to mention that academic impact um, is really a small segment of impact. However, it's emphasized and frequently discussed because it's much easier to quantify and to measure than non-academic impact, which makes it easier to compare researchers to each other. And that's how we discuss things like promotion and tenure and grants, is looking at the actual numbers of these kind of things. So that's just something to keep in mind as we're talking about this. Next, this is from the same group, University College Dublin, and this is just showing research impact from the timeline perspective of the research process. As you're familiar, you start with your inputs, you gather your resources, then you complete the activities, you do the research, you run the experiment, you build the prototype, the engine, whatever it is you're doing, and then you have your outcomes. This is the publication. This is the item, physical or tangible or not. This is the product at the end. This is what you were doing it for. Then you have your outcomes. This is how many times you've been cited, how many people are looking at your work, how many people are interacting with it in some way, shape, or form. And then you have your impacts or the consequences of your work. And consequences makes it sound a lot worse than it actually is, but it's how are people taking what they've learned from your work and using that outside? What are they doing with that information? That's just another perspective of looking at this. So why is this important? Why should you care individually as a researcher or a faculty member about your research impact? Well, really, it's to justify the funding and the investment that people put into your work. It increases transparency between you and the stakeholders and showing that you're doing what you said you were going to do. Um, Having this kind of impact increases your chances of getting other grants or getting promoted or tenured, or even getting awards in different associations. At this point, I need to make it clear, obviously, I can't guarantee that impact is something that you have to check off as part of your promotion or your annual review process um, on a department or even a university level. I can say, though, that this is a growing trend. It's becoming a lot more popular with different universities, especially research-heavy universities. And so I wouldn't be surprised that as the years go on, that more and more colleges are requiring faculty members to include this information as part of their review. So I encourage everyone to just look at it, start becoming familiar with some of these terms, because I think it will be beneficial for you in the long run. Aside from that, being aware of your own impact helps keep you in touch with what your field is doing, and that can lead you to different collaboration opportunities between you and other researchers, especially those outside of your university that you might not otherwise talk to or interact with. So there's two main ways of measuring research impact, bibliometrics and altmetrics. Bibliometrics are the traditional method. They've been around a while. This is the H-index, the citation count, the impact factor, etc. And it's very useful for demonstrating impact with traditional methods or in traditional mediums like articles or books. Altmetrics or alternative metrics, this is a way of usually interacting with non-traditional media. You can still definitely use it for articles and books, but it's just more built with non-traditional, it's more popular with non-traditional mediums. These are things like views, downloads, mentions, retweets, patents, print news coverage, things like that, interactions in the non-academic space. Altmetrics is much newer. It's only been around 20-ish years, and bibliometrics have been around since, I believe, the 1960s. Um, and so it's much newer. It's not as common or as popular at this point, but it's really growing. Altmetrics are very good if you're, like I said, non-traditional methods, if you're hosting or putting on events or art shows or galleries or things like that, or if you're creating OER. So why am I talking about this? What's the point I'm trying to make here? The main point of my presentation is this. Faculty members who create OER materials can and should use these materials as evidence of their impact and their influence. This information can then be used as part of their portfolio for promotion, tenure, or to receive grants. Traditional research impact assessments, like bibliometrics, as we talked about, may not capture the full influence of OER because they're not really being cited in the same way. However, altmetrics and other usage analytic-like information can provide valuable evidence. Especially as time goes on and OER has become more and more popular with universities and with faculty members, OER can be leveraged as legitimate academic output with measurable impact. So let's talk about creating OER for a second. There are many different platforms that people use to share and post their OER that they've created. The ones I'm familiar with are OER Commons and Open Syllabus. If you haven't looked at these before, I encourage you to do so, but there's a lot of other platforms. So I'm not saying you have to use any specific one, but these two specifically do provide some analytical information about how many people are looking at your work, how many people are using it, adapting it, in what areas, what schools, what countries. And that kind of information can be useful when we're talking about impact assessments and including that information as part of your portfolio. I also encourage faculty members to look at more qualitative evidence. If you happen to know someone who is using your OER, whether that's a colleague or someone at a different university who's teaching in your field, interview them, talk to them. How have they benefited from using your work? How have their students benefited? What are some of the positives about it being so accessible? Include that kind of information as well to kind of just add depth to your impact assessment, and include some other information that you just can't get from just numbers. So let's talk about tenure or promotion. Depending on where you work, tenure obviously may not be an option. I'm a big proponent of including impact as part of your promotion or tenure portfolio, even if you're not currently required to do so, or even if you're never required to do so. I personally believe that it's easier to draw a line connecting creating OER to impact than adapting or adopting OER and relating them to impact. That's not to say it can't be done or that adapting or adopting OER doesn't affect your impact or influence at all. I just haven't seen a lot of research on that, so um, I can't make a full distinction at this point um, yet. So I encourage, if you're talking purely about impact, I encourage faculty members to create OER. But that being said, obviously that's a lot of work. It's time consuming. It might not be an option for everyone. You might just not want to do it. That's totally fine. If you are choosing to adopt or adapt OER rather than create them, that is still information to be used in your portfolio. Many universities, like I mentioned before, are recognizing OER as legitimate academic contribution, so any interactions you have with it should be included. And some institutions are even incorporating OER development into tenure and promotion guidelines. And in most of these kind of reviews, promotion, or just annual evaluations, faculty members' accomplishments and tasks are split up into 3 groups: teaching, service, and research. So that's how we're going to split up these activities from here on out. So this chart and the chart that I'm going to show on the next 2 slides is from Driving OER Sustainability for Student Success, or DOERS, or DOERS 3. I'm not sure how they prefer it to be pronounced. These charts are intended to be used as a guide for faculty when including OER in their promotion and tenure portfolios. And this one specifically is arguing that creating OER can fall under the research or teaching categories if you're allowing your colleagues to review your work. So that's another side of it that you need to include. You can't just mention like, hey, I made this thing. You have to back it up and show the impact and the effects of doing that. Also on the DOERS website, they do have a common rubric for evaluating open textbooks, and it covers a lot of different aspects like comprehensiveness, clarity, organization, consistency, relevance, etc. And if you're in the middle of doing something like that, I highly encourage you to take a look at that. It was very helpful, and I just think it's very useful if you're doing something like this. But if you're adapting OER rather than creating, this is still something to be included. For example, if you revised another's OER to be more relevant to your students, could fall under teaching or service categories, or if you revised it to be in more alignment with course teaching outcomes, could still be with teaching. But with both of these examples, faculty members must follow up with their students and survey them in some way, shape, or form to determine the effect that OER had on their learning and their experiences. And if you're adopting OER, again, still use it, still include it. Using OER in a class or using an open access research article can be part of the teaching category. Again, you would still need to survey your students and include those results and show the effect that OER had on their learning, or provide evidence of the articles you used. Again, I highly encourage everyone, if you're interested at all in this, take a look at the DOERS website. They go into more depth of these explanations and the arguments of how this falls under different categories. It gives a lot more information that I just don't have the time to go into during this presentation. So definitely check that out if this is interesting or useful for you. Now let's talk about student success. How are we wrapping all of this back together? When faculty members create OER materials, or if they are just adopting or adapting, including it in their promotion or tenure portfolios, when you get promoted or you get these kind of grants, you have more resources at your disposal, or in the case of promotion, you were able to get or you are eligible for different resources that you now have at your disposal to conduct more research. I believe that whenever it is possible, students should be included in this form of research. Opportunities like this allow students to learn more about the research process in academia, publishing process, and other things that are not explicitly covered in their courses. One thing that I've personally run into with other early career researchers is that there are some parts of the research and the publishing process specifically that are not explicitly taught in courses. And so when they start to get their first faculty positions and these first kind of jobs, they're missing some vital information because it's just not something that's explicitly discussed, like predatory publishing, who to stay away from, what are some red flags in the publishing world. It's things that aren't usually covered in even grad level graduate level courses, but during experiences like this, students are able to actually learn from this, and so that way they have a better understanding of expectations and how this all works when they enter their first career or professional job. I understand why faculty members might not want to interact with OER. I've heard a lot of different reasons for not wanting to do so or not having done it yet. It's a big adjustment, especially for faculty members who have been in the field for decades and haven't done anything with OER and don't want to at this point. My goal with this presentation was just to offer different incentives that I encourage people to bring up with their faculty members, just as extra encouragement to make that final leap into OER if they're not fully engaging with it yet. And again, if you choose to create them, you have a clear method for measuring and increasing your influence as a researcher. And whether you choose to adopt, adapt, or create OER, it's an important inclusion in your portfolio. Thank you all so much for watching my presentation. If you have any questions or you'd like to discuss this more with me, my email is on the screen. Thank you all so much for watching, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the symposium.